gentlemen. Welcome to CIBSE Technical Seminar this evening. Tonight's presentation has not been delivered by Schneider on designing and commissioning ability. Unfortunately, the speaker, has he left the company or something? Yeah. John? No. Okay. Tonight's presentation is delivered by Stephen Gathergood, who is the co-author of Competency and Competency Management Systems and Facilities Management, which is a mouthful. Stephen's going to go through the presentation, and you'll take. Do you want to take questions as we go through?
I'll prefer them at the end, I think. If that's all right.
We'll leave questions to the end. Tonight's presentation, again, it's been videoed and it'll be uploaded onto YouTube for committee members and anyone else to watch. I'll hand you over to Stephen. The floor is yours.
Okay, many thanks. So, thank you, good evening. So tonight I'm going to deliver just a slightly adapted version of the presentation that I jointly gave with the co-authors there, Steve Hunter and Joanna Harris, last month on the 11th of January, which was the official launch of this rather long-awaited publication. So, without further ado, what's the motivation for it? There we go. So the motivation was really about Guide M. So you'll remember 2015 I presented the update on Guide M. There were two specific chapters, chapter 15 and 17, legislation and training, caused a rather large amount of debate amongst the team at that time. The result of which was a stark realisation that the subject area of competency per se wasn't particularly well defined within the building services or within the facilities management industry. So, with emerging legislation referring more and more to the competent person, requiring those people to be reasonable for things like risk assessments, ensuring compliance with regulations and the like, the brief of the committee at that time in Guide M couldn't accommodate the development of competency anymore within the timescale. So effectively what we said was we'd park it within Guide M at that time, and we'd then look at producing a follow-on standalone document to address that wider question. And here we are now some 2 years later, and KS21 has finally hit the market. So, what is it? It's not intended to be definitive. It's really a guide. It's there to try and help people in terms of understanding what it is that they need to do, and how that they can develop their people individually, and in so doing, improve the corporate competency of the business within which they operate. So, why talk about it? We have inadvertently created a skills deficit, really as a direct impact of the reduction of investment in apprentices over time. That's been driven by organisations tightening the purse strings in what's become an increasingly competitive marketplace. Money was tight in the first place, but margins now being squeezed, and they continue to be cut dangerously thin in an attempt to secure turnover. We've seen that recently. Look at Carillion, look at Interserve, look at Capita. They're all suffering from these decisions that they've made. Projecting forward, it's likely that Brexit will also play a part in closing down some doors that we'll see. So skilled labour that we've previously enjoyed from within the European Union. We may not have that opportunity in the future. So the accepted practice that's driven in many cases by those commercial pressures to use multi-skilled people as a single resource to do a job which historically has been done by specialists does cause a problem. We end up with this jack of all trades scenario rather than experts. And I think we have to recognise that you know, we're all sponges to an extent. We can only hold so much, and there comes a point where actually the multi-skilled person doesn't have the skills that they need to do some of the more serious pieces of work that require that expertise. And as I say, against the backdrop of this decline in resources, the legislators keep pushing more and more responsibility onto the responsible person within organisations. And of course, they're looking towards the competent person to help them comply. So this is really, really important. Whoops. So why produce the document? Well, firstly, we want to encourage people to better understand what they should be doing, both for themselves and within their organisations. From management positions at the top, all the way down to appointed roles throughout that supply chain, right down to the operative that's actually doing the task at the coalface. And it doesn't really matter what that position is and what that task is, there is a level of competence needed by every individual for every task. It will vary in relation to the risk associated with that. We'll talk about that in a minute. It's also to inspire people and organisations to look inwards and just to question, to appraise, to self-audit, and to look at their own internal operating procedures and processes. To provide a go-to source of credible, professional information and guidance to help people and organisations protect themselves from, obviously, compliance infringement. And lastly, to improve on what's happening in our industry and to allow us to move forward, hopefully, in an aligned way. Because at the moment, there doesn't appear to be a great deal of documentation out there that's really guiding that. So what do you guys need to do? So in order to succeed in any business, I think we'll all agree there are three things. This might be a simplification, but in essence, it's people, process and product. We need competent people with the right behaviours and the right attitudes to do their jobs properly. We need processes in place to realise and demonstrate our capability. And we need the right products or tools to allow us to do our job competently. So KS21 primarily considers people, but it does hint about process and tools. So in particular, it looks at how we can develop and become competent, how we can maintain it, manage it, and in so doing, show how professional we are as people. And of course, collectively, our people make up the organisation within which we work. So, we probably all think that we work for competent organisations. Otherwise, we may have actually made a different decision in our career path. But it's really difficult to achieve that corporate competence to which we're aspiring. But if you employ people that are competent and that they exhibit the behaviours that you want and they safely manage the business, then you're on the right track. But we need to be proactively looking for gaps. We need to identify them and close them, and obviously, preferably, before we fall down them. So, accreditation bodies, yes, they can help, but generally, that's about an assurance at a point in time, and it's usually sample-based, so it doesn't necessarily look at the depth that maybe you should do in your own organisation. And of course, competence should be regularly assessed at an appropriate frequency. And I won't tell you what that frequency is because it depends. So, developing and maintaining competence, it's a life journey. This doesn't happen very quickly, and for some of us, it will be exactly that throughout our entire career. It's not going to be an easy task for many of us. Human resources, those teams can help. In building services and FM, it's really important though to look at technical competence generally and to look at it from a technical point of view, not from an HR point of view. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that over recent years, the role of HR teams, it should be about protecting the human resource, but it's diminished really to principally look at pay, rations and conduct. So I don't want to rubbish HR people, but I have a view that they're not doing enough. And we really think that in the role and the journey of competency, HR have a much greater role to play in the tracking and the management of our people. You need competent people, obviously, in your team so they can protect themselves, as I say, protect line and departmental managers, to protect customers, and the organisation's reputation, and, of course, the organisation's future. So, what does the publication offer? It explores and offers a focused insight into the real need for competency and why it's particularly important on high risk and safety related systems. It's important that it's not, an importance that's not just inferred due to safe working practice, but something that's demanded and enforced by the UK legal system. It's not unreasonable, importantly, that in the event of an incident or an accident, that a failure for a company, organisation to be able to demonstrate that competency will result in punitive measures. They could be financial, they could be custodial, they could be both. We don't really understand the risks in our organisations and in our industry as to what those punitive damages will look like. The document explains risk, proportionality, and the liability associated with considerations for specific competence roles. And I'll come back to some of those in a minute. But importantly, the critical mass and the effective management of that individual competency will lead to strong corporate competency. And corporate competency is what really customers will be looking for when they want to contract with you as an organisation. The link to HR, as I've mentioned, it is hugely important. And just a quick fact, that the combined cost of our people in a typical organisation in the FM sector can be as much as 60% of the total operating costs. Now, just think about that for a minute. That's a hell of a lot of money that we're investing in people to recruit them and put them to work, and then arguably we're not really managing and maintaining that resource. It's almost criminal. And lastly, managing and controlling, developing and maintaining that knowledge that's locked away, as I say, in that staff, will help you achieve your organisation's benefit through competency management system, which we'll talk about again later in terms of what attributes we think that should have. But before I go on to that, I'm just going to clear up a misunderstanding around competencies versus competent. Unfortunately, people use these words interchangeably and they mean completely different things. So, I've mentioned HR functions. You've probably all seen these frameworks that they love to throw out, and it's a management competencies framework or an administrative competencies framework, and it's a number of boxes with descriptors in it, and your line manager looks at you and says, do you know what, I think Fred sits in this box, and he's either on the left or on the right, and he's somewhere in that box, and there's a grading of a competency. That doesn't mean that that individual is competent. It is just a behavioural trait. It is one of many, and it's an ingredient to effectively a much bigger cake, if you like, of what that individual needs to hold. So I think what I want you to take away from this is that competencies should be considered as behaviours that excellent performers exhibit much more consistently than average performers. And to become competent, we must consider the attainment of a relevant grouping of behaviours, or those competencies, that, when taken together, better describe and communicate that individual's performance expectations. So what that's basically saying is that saying to become competent, you need a number of facets. And it's not textbook, it's not prescribed, it needs to be assessed on a role-by-role basis, and not from a matrix that subjectively places an individual in a box. There's more science to it than that. So, now the fun part. Competency, what is it? So, hopefully that's making you smile. But actually, it's a really serious message. If you put tools in the hands of the people that aren't competent to use them, you're putting your entire hierarchy of people at risk. Some from physical injury, so you may end up with a bit of a bump on the head. And other aspects, disciplinaries, financial compensation, future career and earnings potentials. It's significant. In severe cases, of course, we shouldn't rule out the possibility of that custodial sentence that I mentioned earlier. Wrong way. There we go. So, competency is a measure of an individual's ability in terms of their knowledge, skills and behaviours to perform a given role. Capability, however, can be considered as the ability of the organisation to perform its function. So in our sector, this generally means delivering a product or a service, as I mentioned. Competency assessment within an organisation, if carried out correctly and at the prescribed frequency appropriate to the task and the job role, will demonstrate an organisation's overall capability and will lead to improved customer confidence. And what that means is potentially you'll win more work. So simplistically, confidence by your potential customer is a very simple equation. Organisational capability plus the competence of the people within which it works. And all of that will contribute to corporate competence, which is where your organisation ought to be aspiring. So, competence explained. This was a difficult one because there are millions of definitions that sit on the internet. Everybody has their own slant as to what competency really is. What you'll find is that most organisations will bend it slightly to fit the sector that they're in. So the working at height, for example, competency statement leans very much towards working at height. What a surprise. The competency statement for water hygiene leans very much towards water. So what we've tried to do is just to give you a flavour here to say these 3 bullet points we think sum up competency irrespective of sector and irrespective of where they're applied. So it's about skills, training, knowledge, experience and the ability of the person, their ability to apply and perform a task safely, and it will include physical attributes and attitude. So we probably know that you can't work at height if you're over a certain weight limit. That's defined, and that's for a blooming good reason because of momentum forces if you fall and all of those good things. Practical skills, thinking skills, experience and knowledge, a willingness to undertake work activities. If you ask an individual to do a job that they don't want to do, the likelihood that that individual will have an incident or an accident is much, much greater than if you have an individual that wants to do the task. You must consider some of these basic things in terms of the way that we think when you're considering, is that operative competent to fulfil that role? The triangle at the bottom you've probably all seen before, but I've included it just to really ram home how this issue of competence and the fact that it's mentioned in primary and secondary legislation and the need for responsible and competent people fits. So you have obviously acts and regulations that sit at the top, augmented by approved codes of practice and further guidance. And if you've had a chance or in your roles you have to comply with a number of these documentations that are produced, you will see numerous references to competent, competency, responsible, and it will ask you to ensure you have these people in place, that they are properly appointed. It will not tell you how to do it or what attributes they need. That's down to you. And if you can't demonstrate that you've gone through a process to ensure that that individual has those necessary capabilities and competencies, again, you may find yourself caught short. I touched earlier on appointed roles. So I don't want to get too hung up on this, but there are a number of roles that you see in people's job descriptions, and I've mentioned a few in the bubble there, that generally you find in legislation or best practice guidance, most of which have spawned from MOD or healthcare environments in terms of roles that require a level of skill and shall we say authority over and above that of a normal person. As I say, they're referenced in JD, in job descriptions quite often, but unfortunately organisations fail to put the definition in there as to what it really means and what the role function includes, which again is not great because it leaves the company slightly exposed, because there are no boundaries set around what that particular role is and is not able to do within the remit of his capability. So appointment to those roles, if you're appointed as an authorising engineer, for example, that's not it's not a competency in its own right. It's just a title. It intrinsically linked to competence, but of course that competence needs to be earned. Those appointments are usually formally granted and accepted, and in so doing they should be auditable and they should be demonstrable. You need to be able to demonstrate your audit trail through a paper-based system of a process whereby they've actually been through a training and development program, site-specific awareness, familiarisation, all of those types of things depending on the role that they're fulfilling. The important thing is that they do assert a level of confidence. So if I've got somebody that's appointed as a designated person and that's what they're saying they are, I infer that they've gained that through an appropriate manner. Again, if those responsibilities aren't defined properly and boundaries set, then again, that inference could be wrong. And in so being wrong, you inadvertently may ask them to perform tasks and functions which is out with their competence standard, which puts him, you, and your organisation at risk, as I say. What is important, though, is just to remember people in those types of roles, if appointed properly, they can be more readily relied upon for expert advice than those that aren't. So I would always defer to my authorising engineer if I was an authorised person and I wasn't sure, because that's the right place to go in terms of organisational hierarchy. Okay, this is something which I sketched up a while ago and it's found its way in, so apologies for the poor artistic flavour, but this is my attempt at trying to demonstrate how competence moves over an individual's working life. So I aptly called it the Competence Continuum, and it tries to show the interrelationship between supervision primarily and management, relative of course to competence. So what we show here is that effectively supervision is directly inversely proportional to competence. So on the left-hand side, we have, let's say, an apprentice who's relatively new in the role, doesn't really know the ropes too much. He might have his certification for a particular role, but he's not really worked on it too much. He needs quite a lot of supervision to make sure that he's actually applying what he's learned correctly and in the right manner. And as he gets familiar, and he does this day in, day out, and starts to learn what he's doing, he grows personally, and he moves along this line towards the green end. And then we reach utopia after he's been doing the job for a number of months or years, depending on what that task is, and it's like falling off a log to him. So actually he does it without thinking almost, and he needs a minimum level of supervision. And unfortunately then something happens. There's an external factor. So what happens is that there's a change in environment. We want you to go off of that site, please, and we want you to work on this site, doing exactly the same thing, but on a different site in a different location. So all of a sudden, he's now got some different things to consider. Before he was working at ground level on this particular job, now he's working at the first floor. So there's some slightly different risks which he's got to take into account. But instead of now doing things manually, he's now got this gizmo, piece of technology that's changed, and he's doing the job in a slightly different way. So what's happening now is he's slipping back down this continuum. He's now less competent than he was because something's acted on him which is outside of his reasonable control. So in response to that, we need to increase the level of supervision momentarily until he understands the changing environment. We need maybe to review and assess his training on the new technological piece of gizmo that he's working with until he's now comfortable and understands how to use that. And then he starts to move back and the supervision can ease off. This, I mentioned earlier, this is a life journey. It's not static, whatever, we all know that. Organisations change, attitude and cognitive attributes. The guy's got something going on at home. He's going through a divorce. And he's got trouble paying the mortgage. These are all distractors. They're external factors that we as managers need to understand about our people so that we can put in corrective actions. Do we think about these things enough? I don't know. Some of us aren't maybe close to our people as we should be. And I know from bitter experience when people do get distracted, human error creeps in. And when human error creeps in, it can be the simplest little thing that has significant ramifications and knock-ons, not only in terms of personal health, safety and well-being, but maybe in terms of the business, the process, or the infrastructure that it's supporting. It's fairly crude in as much as FM, building services, it's massively diverse. I can't cover every eventuality. But if you look at that and think about that in slower time, you will find some synergies probably with most aspects of what you do in your businesses. Adapt it, grow it, customise it. The principle is sound. So a word of caution just on that continuum. We've come across in the process of putting this guide together a number of organisations grade competence with descriptors. Knowledgeable, proficient, advanced, and at the other end, trainee, supervised practitioner, practitioner, expert. Lovely words, but what do they mean? Unless they're defined within your business process, then I would canvass you to steer clear of them. They're not universally defined within the industry. They are somebody's perception of where somebody sits on that line or on that continuum. And if you, as an individual, for example, know that you're proficient at your particular job for, I don't know, J. Sainsbury's, and you then decide to move to Tesco's to do something similar, then actually you may not still be proficient, because the definition within their organisational structure, if in fact they have one, might mean something completely different. So my word of caution there is again, don't get too hung up on titles. Look at each job and each task and each role on its own merits. As I say, the fact they're not universally defined is a bit of a worry. Okay, I mentioned risk and proportionality. So again, hugely important. And I will just read that top bit because, again, it's another really good takeaway for you. The level of competence that is required by an individual or organisation to undertake a specific job, function or task should always be in proportion to the importance